Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to today's DevOps.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Teleport. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting program ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of the screen. For any other general comments, we do want you to use the chat tab, so go ahead and warm that up for us. Let us know from where you're tuning in or maybe what role you play in your organization. And if you check out the handouts tab on the right side of the screen, you'll find a copy of the slides available for download for you. So feel free to grab those at your own leisure. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So our topic today is securely delegating access to your AWS resources. And I'm joined today by Alan Valancourt, Partner Solutions Engineer at Teleport, and Amaya Paldekar, Partner Solutions Architect at AWS. So Amaya, Alan, thank you both so much for being here with me today. Alan, do you want to go ahead and take it from here?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Cody. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk today. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. And as Cody mentioned, my name's Alan Valancourt. I'm a Teleport Partner Solutions Engineer here working out of South Carolina remotely. And we also have Amaya as well. And go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. Hey, everyone. My name is Amaya Paldekar. I'm a Partner Success Solutions Architect here at AWS based out of San Diego. And I focus on our startup customers.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to tag team today's webinar and definitely want, Q&A, want some questions as we have time here at the end. But just want to go briefly, what is today's agenda? What are we going to talk about? And appreciate you taking time to spend some time with us today. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what is Teleport? And then Amaya is going to jump in and discuss and talk about AWS IAM Identity Center. And then we'll segue back into how enterprises are managing current AWS infrastructure, some challenges in securing, delegating access to this infrastructure, and then, integrating Teleport with AWS IAM, and then a couple advantages of why you'd want to use Teleport to manage your AWS infrastructure. So there's a lot there. So let's jump right into it. So the first question, if you're brand new to Teleport, you're probably like, what is Teleport? So I'm going to take a few minutes here and we'll talk through this. And hopefully this will kind of clear the air a little bit and, whet your appetite of, making it a little bit more exciting. So Teleport is an identity native infrastructure access. And when we talk about identity native, we are talking about your identity, you as a person. So me as Alan, Cody, or Amaya, or John Doe, right? That is your identity. So we use this with secretless as well as zero trust. When we talk about secretless, we're talking about no passwords, no legacy PAM solutions, no key vaults where you're storing SSH keys or API tokens. And then, of course, no productivity loss, because if you're not having to pull from all these resources, you're not going to have some of those kind of legacy baggage that might slow you down. On the zero trust side, we're doing it based on identity. So identity-based access, right? Hey, who I am, what I am, etc. Teleport uses an internet-facing access proxy that gates this access from any location throughout the world. We're network agnostic and doing it all without a VPN. So a lot of organizations today are tightening security or managing access using homegrown solutions, VPNs, and we're doing all of this without a VPN. And so a 5,000-foot view of what it does and how it works is you have your engineers or your machines, etc., on the left-hand side here, right? Using the normal tools they're familiar with. Kube control, Lens, database clients, web-based browsers, command line, API. And they want to get to their infrastructure on AWS, whether it's, EC2 instances, EKS or their own Kubernetes, RDS databases, whether it's Postgres or MySQL, even Windows servers that might be on AWS, Mongo databases, and more from anywhere in the world. And so by going through Teleport, they're talking to your identity provider. So in this case, like today, using something like AWS IAM as your identity provider, getting that saying, hey, you are who you say you are. Now we're going to let you access these resources using short-lived certificates. Then, of course, we also have this ability to do just-in-time access using tools like Slack or Teams. That's not listed here. That's one of our newer plugins, PagerDuty, etc. And so how we do this is you're going to hear some themes as I talk through this. It's identity for everything, because we're really key on that piece there. And so when you use your identity and you tie that in with like device security, right? Touch IDs, HSMs, TPM, platforms that has that encrypted device security there. Your proof of presence, right? Using your YubiKey or your multi-factor authentication that says, hey, I'm verifying that, hey, I'm here and I have the right tools, etc. And then that mutual authentication piece there, where Teleport is using mutual TLS and OpenSSH based certificates. So all that transaction, all that activity going throughout from you to your infrastructure on AWS is all encrypted using all of these methods. And so why engineers love Teleport? Well, they can manage all of this from one access plane. You don't have to have a homegrown solution. You don't have to fire up a VPN and do 2 or 3 different pieces just to gain access into a resource, right? We're infrastructure agnostic. So, today we're talking about AWS, and that's awesome because we love AWS. We're first-class citizen within AWS, but we got a lot of customers that use on-prem, right? They might have an on-prem system, or they use some of the other public clouds or private clouds out there. Teleport doesn't really care because we're agnostic along that line. And then we can tie in things like just-in-time access. As I mentioned that first slide, where you can see where a user might have access just to something, and then maybe they need temporary access to another system or another application. Then you can use Teleport to manage that just-in-time access. And then lastly, third-party integrations. As mentioned, Teams, PagerDuty, Slack, Discord, etc., are ways that developers and engineers can tightly tie things into their infrastructure, all from within one system. So segue that to, that was the developers and engineers, right? So what about security teams? Because in today's world, today's DevOps or DevSecOps world, right, we have that blend of both devs, engineers, and security. Devs want to run fast, do things quickly. I used to be a developer. I also used to work in security. So I've seen both sides of the fence there, right? Security teams love Teleport because we have this single source of truth. We know where all our connectivities, where users are coming from. They love it because it's zero trust, using beyond core principles, and that zero trust, even though that word's been used a lot, we truly are leveraging that in gaining access to infrastructure. We're rendering phishing and pivot attacks useless. Why? Because we're not using password vaults or keys or secrets. And because it's based on identity and, multi-factor authentication, that we slow and render these types of attacks useless, and it lowers that attack vector for, potential hacks within your organization. And then another one here, which is huge, reduce that audit and compliance burden. So many organizations today have to have SOC 2, HIPAA, GDPR, CDPA. I think this is the California one. All these different compliance and audit burdens. And many times they're doing it very manual process. Well, when you implement a tool like Teleport, that simplifies all that, because we look at what's required on that, and we provide the ability to meet a lot of these standards out there for sure. And of course, connect to your AWS infrastructure. A few things here. It doesn't matter. Whatever you have on the AWS side, we can manage it within Teleport. And of course, it's your single source of truth for infrastructure access, right? Identity native, eliminating secrets and pivots. We're consolidating access and we're modernizing security. Another great feature of Teleport is we're open source. And this link is also in the slides that Cody had mentioned that you can download. Is you can go out there and see what we're doing within Teleport today. You can download our binaries. You can download our open source. You can get involved in the community. This slide is actually outdated. It has us at 12,000 stars. We're over 13,000 stars now within our GitHub. A lot of activity. You can even see what our team is building out for the future. You know, our RFDs and what upcoming releases that might be coming down the road as well. So I'm going to segue. I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to switch over to Amir. He's going to talk about AWS IAM Identity Center.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. So today I'll be giving an overview of AWS IAM Identity Center, and we'll talk about how you can leverage this service to provision access to AWS account and other business applications that you might be using. A lot of you might be aware of AWS Single Sign-On Service, SSO, and that was recently renamed to AWS IAM Identity Center. And it's our recommended workforce identity strategy so that customers can manage who has access to what across all of their AWS accounts. And not just AWS accounts, but customers can also manage access to some of the other cloud business applications that they might be using within their organizations. So with that, let's get started. Next slide, please. All right. So in terms of access and permissions management, what do customers today want, right? First, they want to be able to manage identities and access so that they can provision fine-grained permissions across multiple AWS accounts within their organizations. Second, they want to enable seamless integration so that users can take advantage of single sign-on, which basically means using the same set of credentials for logging into your AWS Console, CLI, as well as to other business applications seamlessly through a single sign-on portal. And then finally, customers also want to simplify this entire process of single sign-on. But before we dive into how Identity Center solves for all these problems, let's take a step back and see the challenges that our customers were facing with legacy ways of identity and permissions management. Next slide, please. All right. So if we went back to the origins of AWS IAM and look at the legacy way of granting user permissions to access resources, imagine on the left, there's a user named Bob, and he wants access to resources in account 1 on the right. The admin that manages account 1 would create an IAM user for Bob and provide him with a password, right? And then what Bob would do is he would navigate to the console, enter his credentials, and in case he wanted to access the CLI, he would create access keys within AWS. Now, this mechanism does not scale well. Companies have thousands of users, and creating so many users in an account is a lot of management overhead. Now, imagine that the same company manages hundreds of AWS accounts as well. Now, this becomes even more difficult to scale. Next slide, please. All right. So in order to improve that experience, we created ways to basically improve the user experience through identity federation trusts. So this method allowed to federate each of the accounts with an identity provider of your choice, such as Active Directory, Okta, Ping, to name a few. This was an improvement from the previous method of managing each account individually. However, the AWS account administrators still needed to create the roles in each account, attach the policies, and make the assignments. In addition, they also needed to establish federation trusts between each AWS account and your external identity provider. This was still a lot of work and not easy to manage, especially when companies scaled up in terms of the total AWS accounts they were managing. Next slide. Right, and this is where AWS IAM Identity Center comes into picture. So as I mentioned earlier, this is basically a service that helps centrally manage single sign-on access to AWS accounts and business applications. Looking at some of the core functionalities and use cases of Identity Center, First, it allows you to easily manage AWS accounts and role access at scale. So if you have 5, 10, or even hundreds of AWS accounts, Identity Center makes it easy to manage permissions. Secondly, customers have the ability to bring their own identities or to create them natively. And we are going to talk about this in the next slide. Next, single sign-on from command line interface. So your developers can now sign in directly to the CLI and get automated short-term credentials. As a result, developers can sign in and stay in the CLI without the need to generate and copy access keys manually. This is a huge benefit, and it definitely increases developer productivity as well. Next, IAM Identity Center also supports single sign-on for first-party integrated applications such as Amazon SageMaker Studio or AWS IoT Sitewise. And then finally, Identity Center also supports one sign-in experience for multiple different cloud business applications. So you have an option to integrate applications like Salesforce, Tableau, Box, or any other custom application that you might be using that supports SAML 2.0. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an introduction to the identity stores that you can use with IAM Identity Center. The first option, of course, is to create and manage user identities natively in IAM Identity Center. So this is a very good option for you in case you're starting from scratch, and in case you do not have an existing workforce identity solution. What you would do is you would just create user identities within the Identity Center. And the other option, of course, is to connect Identity Center with your existing identity source, including Active Directory, Okta, Azure, so on and so forth. One thing that I'd like to mention here is that identities from your existing provider must be provisioned into Identity Center before you can assign permissions. So let's say if you're using Active Directory, for example, right? As your existing identity store, what you can do is you can connect Identity Center to Active Directory using AWS Directory Services. In case you're using external identity providers like Okta, you can synchronize user and group permissions automatically into Identity Center using the SCIM standard. So to sum this slide up, you have multiple options for identity providers that can be integrated with the Identity Center. Next slide. So let's quickly talk about how you can manage permissions. One of the prerequisites of using Identity Center is that you should be leveraging AWS organizations to manage all the multiple accounts within your company. So you have your existing users and groups that are synced from either created natively in Identity Center or synced from external identity sources. And then you have a list of all AWS accounts within the organizations. And using that within Identity Center, you can set up granular permissions for users and groups to the resources within your different AWS accounts. Next slide. So let's take an example of how you can assign permissions, right? In this example, in case you're using an on-premises Active Directory as your identity store, let's walk through how access is granted. So as I mentioned earlier, you can connect Identity Center to your on-premises Active Directory using AWS Directory Services. And this connection is used to synchronize your user, group, and membership information into the Identity Center. The next step is to create entitlements within Identity Center, which means to map those groups and users to defined permission sets that grant access to either one AWS account, one organizational unit, or an entire organization. So that is how permissions are granted. If we go to the next slide, we'll see how, right. So this is how a user login flow actually works in this case. So still talking about an example of using an on-premises Active Directory as your source identity provider. What happens is when you configure your Identity Center, your users, they get a customized user portal URL that they can use to log into their different AWS accounts. This is personalized for your organization, And then they would be able to log in using their existing Active Directory credentials. And the authentication takes place directly from the source directory in Active Directory, which is why you see authn here being pointed towards the Active Directory on premises. And once the authentication is completed, the Identity Center authorizes the user based on their entitlements that were previously configured. And depending on like what accounts and roles the particular user has access to, the user is provided with all the options, and the user just has to select which account he wants to sign into and which role he wants to sign into as. And he's then finally federated into an IAM role in that particular member AWS account. So that's essentially how the login flow works. One thing that I'd like to repeat here is the passwords are not synchronized across to the Identity Center. The authentication still happens at the source Active Directory. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the reference architecture for the same login flow that we just discussed. So I guess we can keep going to the next slide. All right. So this is a reference architecture for the previous slide. Yeah, that one. So this is, if you can go to the previous slide, Alan, please. Yep. So a reference architecture for non-Active Directory external identity provider, still very similar to the previous architecture. The difference being that instead of using AWS Directory Service, here in this case, the user and group information that is synchronized into the Identity Center via the SCIM standard. Again, the authentication still occurs at the external identity provider, and the authorization is handled within IAM Identity Center, where the entitlements are configured. So still very similar to how you would use this with your Active Directory identity provider. Next slide. Right. So as I was mentioning earlier, you can use Identity Center not just to log into your AWS accounts within your organizations, but it also lets you log into sign on, like single sign on to some of the SAML enabled business applications that you might be using. So the way you would set that up is very similar. Within Identity Center, you would configure and choose applications from a list of pre-integrated applications such as Tableau, Salesforce, Box, so on and so forth, and then assign users that have been already synced from your external identity provider access to these particular applications. Next slide. So here's the reference architecture that shows that. This is showing how single sign-on access to SAML 2.0 supported business application works with Active Directory as your external identity provider. Nothing different happening here from what we have already discussed. Just that the entitlements are configured in Identity Center for the business applications. So when users sign in using their Active Directory credentials, they are authenticated by the Active Directory, and the authorization for the application happens within Identity Center. And then the user is federated into the business application that they choose. This essentially was an overview of how you can use Identity Center to provide single sign-on to AWS accounts and applications. And with that, I'll pass it back to Alan.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amia. Apologize for the slide mishap there for the minute. So, all right,
no problem.
Get my mic camera back on. So, as we take that thinking, right, of whether you're using AWS IAM or another external, et cetera, you can tie that into within Teleport today. And by using that identity, right, to manage what you have within Teleport. So let's talk a little bit about how are enterprises today managing current AWS infrastructure. So let's walk through that here a little bit. So enterprises are doing it through the AWS Console, as Mia mentioned there. the web management console, even the CLI, right? Where, CLI junkies that use the CLI for everything, you can do that for sure. You can use third-party tooling, right? Amazon infrastructure, whether it's CloudFormation, Ansible, Terraform, etc., to manage that. And a couple of pictures to illustrate that, right? You can go through the console, build out your infrastructure manually, do it from the CLI as well, right? And that's how a lot of orgs are doing it today. Organizations, whether you're, small, medium, or large, it's just many times just how it's been done. But there's a couple challenges that occur when you're leveraging and doing this kind of access. Well, what are those? A lot of manual work being done, right? A lot of hands-on keyboard. Maybe an organization does not have a mature infrastructure as code process. So manual scripting, it all lives on one person's laptop or something like that. And it just, we've all been there, I think. Probably a lot of you in this audience are probably shaking your heads thinking, yeah, that's what we're doing today. Automating change can be challenging, right? If we want to change how we're securely delegating access to these resources, there's a lack of knowledge, or there's a lack of a skill set to help with that. Lack of understanding how AWS secures resources, right? When you jump onto an AWS, when you create an account and you are given this smorgasbord, this buffet of services that you can subscribe to and add and click. And if you don't understand how they're secured or how they're not secured, that can pose and leave you wide open to potential attacks. Misconfiguration of IAM roles and policies is another big one, right? We're so used to, when Amia was talking that first slide, right? User Bob, 3 different AWS accounts. We got to create something individually for him for every account. And then you start rolling to all these different IAM roles and policies that it can get really complicated within AWS. And if you're not understanding proper IAM roles and policies, you might inadvertently give somebody access to something they shouldn't have. And then another is knowing how cloud-based access and security is different from X. And when I put X, that could be other clouds, that could be your on-prem. A lot of traditional sysadmins or developers that might be used to a firewall gated kind of enterprise local area network think that, hey, if I just move it to the cloud, it's the same thing. It's not an apples to apples conversation or a transition. So you have to think how cloud-based access and security is different from what you are currently doing. And of course, as mentioned, audit and compliance challenges, right? A lot of orgs have no standardized process even today, but that's fast changing. A lot of conversations that all of us here at Teleport are talking with customers, we're seeing that companies are starting to say, hey, we need to get standardized on how we do all of this. So let's talk a little bit about integrating Teleport with AWS IAM and how this works. So you can continue the manual process, or you can leverage a tool that tightens access without complicating the process. And so we do that because Teleport has a robust role-based access control engine, and it ties into AWS really seamlessly. Can be very granular how you define access to those resources. And you can even offload your processes from AWS into Teleport itself. So once you've defined it, you've built some of that, then you can actually leverage Teleport to offload and handle some of that itself. Leverage Teleport short-lived certificates to manage access to AWS. So instead of giving out keys that, a lot of times when you're standing up instances, you in IAM, you can download credentials or long-lived keys. And even AWS doesn't necessarily force you to auto-rotate some of those. Well, you can leverage Teleport short-lived certificates that are a core piece of what Teleport does to manage that access into AWS. So let's jump now here into 5 advantages of using Teleport with AWS. And I'll also probably jump in a little bit to, showcase a little bit of some demo stuff as well. Thank you for the questions. For those that have submitted questions, please continue to do so. We've got a little Q&A time here at the end of the webinar that we'll go through and answer all those questions. So definitely please keep typing them in and asking them. All right, so fine-grained control of each AWS service is one way that you can use Teleport. Consistent experience of AWS Console and the CLI. So you're not disrupting what a user, what a developer, what an engineer is used to using. Simplified role-based access control, right? So instead of having a ton of these IAM roles and user and all these policies, you can use Teleport's RBAC engine to help simplify some of that. Just-in-time elevated privileges. So maybe we tighten things down so users only have a certain role or subset of permissions, but in the event they need elevated access or they need other permissions, they can use Teleport's access workflow to request that. That way you're keeping things tight, but then adding as needed on any given time. And then, of course, insights through CloudTrail and the Teleport audit logs. CloudTrail is a great tool for getting an idea of what's happening in your AWS infrastructure of, audit log and events, Teleport audit logs as well, which audits and logs everything that's happening within Teleport. You combine the two of those and you have a great resource to be able to get a better understanding what's going on within your environments. So fine-grained control of each AWS service. What does that look like? So with Teleport's role-based access control engine, you can limit what AWS services your users can access. So you're not just like, hey, let's give this user full admin access to everything, right? We can really tighten that down. That audit trail is captured in Teleport's audit log as well as the AWS CloudTrail service. So for example, you can have developers have read-write access to maybe a certain S3 bucket for updates, like, hey, this S3 bucket, we allow devs to read-write access so they can put new data, new information there. Whereas a contractor team that is using this data from the bucket, but they're just using it for, read-only purposes, you can use them. They only have read access to the same bucket. So within AWS, right, you have this detailed IAM policies. Like right here from the screenshots here, if you just look at AWS Manage Policies, there's, as when I built this slide, right, over 1,000 policies that are out there that you can just use right off the shelf, right? Even breaks it down to job functions. And hey, if I'm a data scientist or if I'm a billing person or a network administrator, this group of policies will apply to me. And that simplifies, at least from a get going, right? If you just, hey, I need something, we've got some of these basic roles and policies that are really helpful. So I encourage you, if you're giving everyone admin access, tighten that down, right? Go through these policies and start looking and saying, does everybody need, power user access or whatever? Let's start, tightening the strings around some of this. So secondly, is you get this consistent experience in using AWS Console and CLI, right? Another advantage. So introducing new tools to any engineer could have the potential to disrupt existing workflows, developer processes, which in turn, could potentially lead to less productivity as they ramp up on these new tools. And, developers, engineers, we're all very specific. It's like the Emacs versus VI versus Nano conversation, right? We're very passionate about how we build stuff and our tools and our user experience, our command line. And when someone says, hey, drops a new tool on you with no explanation or something, now you've got to relearn something all over again. And that disruption, again, knocks down that productivity of what a user is trying to do. Of course, it could even break things if they've got automation or scripts or different things that take advantage. Introducing something in there could potentially disrupt that. So Teleport seamlessly integrates with both the AWS CLI as well as a management console. really to provide that less disruption for engineers and their daily tools and workflows, right? We want to reduce the amount of disruption, but yet provide that layer of security and access. They can continue to use and leverage the same familiar processes that they're used to using, right? They don't have to change a whole lot. And security teams like this because this is a win, because they know that this activity now, AWS activity, is being managed by Teleport. So there's that piece there that makes them sleep better at night. So as an example, and we'll show this here quickly in a quick demo. So I'm using Teleport that's logged in, manage it to view instances, but that same experience is also the same from a command line if I'm not using it. So for example, and we'll jump here quickly, just kind of show, I've got a user that's already logged into Teleport, certificates valid for a few hours. And I can use AWS via Teleport, get information, run this through, and get my information back. From an activity perspective, when I look at my audit log, we can see that, hey, this user was running some AWS console commands. So we know that this user, Valian, is running this activity through Teleport itself. So even if I'm out, and it's really the same thing here. In my case, I still have my local credentials, so I can run it if I'm not logged into Teleport, and you get the same role. So from a developer experience, I'm not disrupting. I'm just adding that Teleport piece in front of it. That way, we're protecting and we're gaining access to these resources. So ideally, in a user workflow, that you would reduce, because if you're using local AWS credentials stored locally, like I have here for today's demo, there's no audit compliance. And if my system gets compromised, potentially someone else could access that. But if I'm using Teleport to manage it, when I log out of Teleport, in this case, so I'm going to log out, and then if I try to access these resources, it's no longer going to work because I'm using Teleport to manage and gate access into my AWS resources. So let's go back to this as soon as it comes up. So that's so hopefully I'll give you a quick idea of how we're not trying to disrupt that user workflow, but yet providing a better layer of security. Another advantage is simplified role-based access control, right? RBAC is one of those things where it can get really detailed, really granular, can be really complex at many times. So with Teleport, once you understand all our roles they're written in YAML, and YAML-driven roles, you can use infrastructure as code, store them in Git, and apply them to your Teleport cluster. And it allows you to be really robust and have granular control so that users can only have access to what they need. Read, write, update, CRUD verbs that we use for a lot of that, time to live, etc. You can also use AWS's ARNs within a role to allow or restrict access to various AWS resources. So going back to that first piece there where you're using AWS IAM, you're tightening down things and say, hey, we've got a role there. This user only needs CloudTrail access or EC2 only access. You can use those policies, those ARNs within Teleport, so that way when a user logs in, that's all they can utilize and see. So you define these robust roles for each and every AWS service that you want to manage. So to reduce that operational headache by managing roles in multiple systems. So as a quick picture, here's what it might look like. So within Teleport, you have these YAML-driven roles. So you can see over here on the right-hand side, I have a specific role called, I'm using an AWS Manage role, EC2 full access, but I'm creating my own policy and role with that has these policies, this role that has these policies applied to it. Then I can take that ARN and put it within my Teleport environment. And then I can use this with any specific AWS or whatever roles that I have within Teleport. And so maybe this EC2 full access, we want to add S3 access to it as well. It's as simple as adding a new policy to it, but still using the same ARN within Teleport. And now that user will log on, they have EC2 and maybe S3 as well. So that's, we're simplifying some of that. Just-in-time elevated privilege, another advantage, right? Just-in-time elevated privileges, where many times today we don't want to give everyone access to everything all the time. Does a user need, back in the day, right? We have our laptops, sysadmins, we had admin rights for everything. Well, in today's world, that's not a good thing because of the potential attack vectors and being hacked and being phished or whatever might happen. So by using just-in-time elevated privileges, you can give users a subset of permissions, but then they can request either automatically or manually access to additional resources. So really, stop giving everyone access to everything all the time, right? Leverage beyond core, leverage zero trust principles, only grant access as needed for a short amount of time. Just-in-time access allows teams to use tools like Slack, Jira, PagerDuty, Team, MS Teams, etc., to elevate permissions on an as-needed basis. So you have this audit trail. If you're running through something like PagerDuty or Jira, you now have a ticketing system that has compliance that shows, hey, elevated access is working through this. So as an example of what this might look like is just-in-time elevated privileges. You got a user contractor that has access, and you can see here on the right-hand side, they now have access into a teleport into AWS based on that. And I'll show that here in real time and just kind of show you what that looks like. So I've got a user, my contractor over here, who normally doesn't have access. So I have no access to AWS, but I can request access and say, you know what? I want access to AWS console access. And for simplicity's sake, we're just using Teleport's UI, but you can run this through Jira or PagerDuty, etc. So we're going to say need access to EC2. They can fire off a request. And now if I have a notification system, an email or Jira ticket or Slack message might come through. In this case, it's going to my other user that's signed in as an admin. And I can see that, oh, I've got a new access. Let's go read it. Here's their notes. I'm going to go ahead and approve it. Approved for a short time. And then we're going to submit this approval process. So now this is all done. And the nice thing is when you go back to that audit trail, what Teleport's doing, right? We've got this access audit trail, so we know at any given time what is happening within our environments. And by the way, all of our log files, they're in JSON format, so you could forward this to a SIEM and build your telemetry observability out of all of this. So this user goes back and they now see, oh, I've been approved. So let's go ahead and assume this role. And whereas previously, remember, I had no applications, but I still don't have servers or Kubernetes. But when I go to applications, I now have application access for a short amount of time. And so there I'm like, sweet, I can now access AWS-based resources. So in this case, I'm going to access EC2, do the work that I need to do, and it should fire up. You can see I have a federated temporary login into this. So now I have EC2 access into this. But maybe they're in here and they're like, well, you know, I'm in here, so I'm going to play around with CloudTrail. Let's see if I can pull that one up here. And what's going to happen is I should be denied, right? I get a is not available for this account. I do not have permissions. Because we're using these granular IAM roles and policies tied with Teleport RBAC, this user can only access EC2 instances. And of course, when it expires in an hour or so, their access to AWS will also terminate. So that's one way of how we're tightening that down and leveraging a tool like Teleport to mitigate that access. So let's continue on. Oop, let me get right there. There you go. And there, last but not definitely least, insights through CloudTrail and Teleport Audit. As I kind of showed a little bit there, how we're auditing all of this information. So Teleport and AWS, we utilize CloudTrail as well as Teleport audit logs to log activity of your users, so you know what's going on at any given time. JSON formatted logs from Teleport, you can export them to a SIEM of your choice for better security reporting and alerting. We're not an alerting reporting tool, but we provide these nicely formatted logs so that you can build that telemetry that you need to. And it provides that complete audit trail for compliance purposes. That way you can say, hey, I know what's happening because I've got an audit trail that says this user is doing this within my clusters. You can utilize AWS DynamoDB to capture all teleport logs and cluster states. So if you're hosting teleport, we use DynamoDB on the back end that captures all of this information as well. And then SSH and kube control exec sessions are replayable, and they're stored on S3 and as well. So you can go back and I didn't show that today, but you can go back and replay. So if your users are SSHing into EC2 instances, you can capture that and replay it back. As an example of what it looks like, and I kind of showed you a little bit, I didn't show the CloudTrail, but here's what a log looks like within Teleport itself. But then within CloudTrail itself, you can see that, hey, this user is accessing this. You get the event ID, you get source, you get an information contractor. So that provides between those two a really robust trail for sure. All right, so that's what we got. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I appreciate everyone's patience. And I'm going to segue over here to our Q&A because I think we have a couple questions here, and we'll go and answer some of these. Awesome, great question. So we'll just start here at the top. So we had here, let me make sure I get the right one. Is any additional security identity center, okay, what are the changes required for the existing identities to move to Identity Center? And is there any additional security Identity Center that provides? Amia, that might be, I think, a question for you on that piece there.
Sure, yeah, I can answer those. So let me start with the one about security features, right? And there's a couple of security features that I'd like to point out here. So first is with Identity Center, it helps you improve access visibility by integrating with AWS CloudTrail. And that way you can get a central place for your organization to audit single sign-on access to AWS accounts and other applications. So that's a huge one. The logging is all centralized. And then the other thing that comes to mind is you can also enable multi-factor authentication capabilities of your identity provider. So based on which external identity provider you are using, you can configure multi-factor authentication with your single sign-on. So those are the two that I'd like to point out. And then I think the other part of the question was what the changes that are required for the existing identities to move to Identity Center, right? So that kind of depends on, I'd say that depends on the external identity provider that you're using. So for example, if you're using Active Directory, you have to use AWS Directory Services. And that helps establish two-way SAML trust between the Active Directory and your Identity Center. And once the SAML trust is established, the identities can then be synchronized into Identity Center, and you can configure that. So what I can also do is I can share a link that explains this process in detail, and you can just read it and try it out for yourself as well. Let me post that link.
Awesome, thank you, Amia, on that one.
No problem.
While you're doing that, let's go to another question here. When users access services such as IAM, S3, RDS, and EKS through Teleport, are they complied with the policies defined by the central enterprise IT team? That is correct. So as users access and you've set it up with your permissions, that would be, that's part of the architecture of an organization as you're deploying Teleport, right? For orgs that have never done this and policies and permissions might be all over the place, you definitely want to spend some time and define these roles and say, hey, we have an admin, we have a developer level 3, right? Developers, they need access to production. What corresponding AWS, S3, RDS, etc. roles that we need to map within that, build it within Teleport, sign it within groups. So when they log into their IDP like AWS, they get that group, it comes across, Teleport says, oh, this is a level 3 production. You're going to get now these specific IAM, ARN, or roles that have been defined for you. So that's how that would work there. Another question here is, let me see, make sure I get them all, is with Teleport's deep integration of AWS IAM and Identity Federation, can users continue to use the most familiar tools to access AWS while complying with policies defined by enterprise? Yes. And I think hopefully I show that, like, hey, I'm comfortable using iTerm in my terminal, right? These are tools that I'm in the AWS CLI. So can I continue to use that? Absolutely. Same thing if you're using like Kubernetes, like Lens is a great open source tool for managing Kubernetes clusters. You can leverage Lens to manage access to your Kubernetes clusters, and Teleport's managing the access through it in the kubeconfig file. Same thing with database clients, right? MySQL Workbench, pgadmin, Popsicle. If you need access to your RDS databases, that Teleport doesn't interfere, just works on the back to secure access to it, but then you can still use those same tools for sure to access those systems. Another question here, with integration with notification tools such as Slack, how can administrators receive alerts and approve or reject requests for privilege escalations? So within Slack itself, is you could basically, we have some really nice guides, whether it's Teams or Slack or Jira, that walk through you. Basically, you're creating a Slack bot for all intents and purposes. And what happens is when that is interacted to listen to events coming from Teleport, like access workflow requests, users that are in that channel will get a link. We do not allow approval from within a tool like Slack or Teams, just from a security consideration, but they will get a link that then they can now log into the cluster, review the request, and then approve it as well. Another question here is, does Teleport depend on service control policy for guardrails? I'm not as familiar with, if you're talking about like AWS service control policies on that. How's Teleport? And then I think I see a follow-up question from you. How's Teleport configured at control tower, multiple organization units accounts? On that piece, like if we got users in multiple OUs and whatever, you can have multiple SSOs tied into Teleport. So it doesn't have to be just AWS. You can have Okta, GitHub, anything that's SAML OIDC compliant. And if a user is in any multiple groups and they come across and they've been defined within Teleport itself, it will map those roles to that user. So if a user's in like help desk as well as, network administration groups that comes across, they'll get those roles for both of those. Now there's some tightness and granularity. So Teleport is a least privileged type of way with our RBAC. So if you have a role that gives a user lesser privileges or time to live, that's going to take precedence over another role. So that's where you really have to kind of plan and use and architect how we're going to have our users and groups set up properly there. Another question here is, how does Teleport address Active Directory vulnerabilities? So I'm not sure, like Teleport itself as a company, so we have a couple ways. We have a site called trust.goteleport.com. That is it is our security. We also have goteleport.com/security. So we have a dedicated security team that any kind of ADs, our team is on all the CVEs, and we are that I have seen from a solutions engineering standpoint and seeing insight into what our devs are doing, we routinely are getting scanned by security audits, right? We're SOC 2, Type 2 compliant. We're always going through audits for both our standalone as well as our SaaS cloud. So vulnerabilities that might come out, especially if it retails toward AD or something like that, our team will quickly investigate, jump on it, look at it, and then, fix it and then backport it to older versions up to a certain, time to live of supported versions. We have actually, with our security platform, we even have a bug bounty program. So if you're a hacker type and you want to go out there and earn some extra money, you can actually go check us out on, I think it's on HackerOne, and go get involved on that to help remediate and submit any kind of bug reports that you might have. Another question, any lab sessions, playgrounds to try? Absolutely. So And I'll show a couple links here at the end of where to get started. But we have a couple ways. You can go to our doc site and download it. Also linked off our doc site is we use a tool called Instruct. It's browser-based labs that you could fire up a teleport cluster and play around with creating a user, adding, I think, a node, and connecting to a database or Kubernetes within a browser environment, so you don't have to install anything. It's a great way to learn teleport, just to kind of get your feet wet and kind of go from there. Let me see here. I think that gets all the questions. These are awesome questions, so thank you everyone for asking all these questions for sure. And let's move on here. And we got a couple minutes, so I want to be cognizant of time. So I want to show that, going back to that one last question, right? Where do I begin? Well, got a bunch of links. And again, these are in the PDF that you can download. You can run it on AWS today. We've got some guides, how to get started, link to our contribution. We even have a, didn't mention that, but we have a Slack community. So would love for you to join our Slack community. If you hop in there, say hello, say, hey, I came here from the webinar. I'm on that Slack community, number of our engineers as well, even our CTO. And we help answer questions as might come up, troubleshoot some things from time to time. But it's a great way to get involved with other teleport users out there as well. And a couple use cases that we have linked. And that's all I've got. So I appreciate everyone's time and patience on today's webinar. I know that was a lot of information, and hopefully you'll give us a shout out. So thank you.
Awesome. Alan, thank you so much. And Amaya, thank you so much for being here as well. I really appreciate all the time and the effort that goes into putting together these 60-minute presentations. So to our audience, I'd like to remind everyone that this session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find the recording on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. So we do still have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. And our winners are Peter R., Neil B., Chrissy S., and Nerlep P. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, please do check your spam folder. I'd like to thank Teleport for sponsoring today's program. And for everyone who spent the last 60 minutes with us, thank you so much for being with us today. We really value your time, but we also value your feedback. So as soon as we close out, there will be a survey that will pop up on your screen. So we really appreciate your input there. Let us know what you liked. Let us know what you'd like to see on future programs. And we really appreciate that. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day. And Amaya and Alan, thank you both once more.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cody.